Okay, in this video, I'm going to use the Gauss-Jordan method for to find what this is in reduced row echelon form. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to solve this linear equation with three variables. So one thing to note is that first I'm going to translate this messy little linear equation into a matrix. So my matrix, I'm using the coefficients, so I have 1, 1, negative 1. I like putting a line here to distinguish that. Negative 1. I have 3, negative 1, 1, and negative 7. And then 1, negative 4, 2, and negative 26. Okay? So that's my first step, is rewriting that. So what I also want to note is that my goal, my end result, is going to be something that looks like a diagonal of 1s, and everything else is zeros, and then I have some constant like A, B, and C. So that is the end goal that that I'm aiming for. And this is going to get really messy. I'm going to just be manipulating it so I can end up with this, because once it's in that form, I can see then that X would equal whatever A is, and Y would equal whatever B is, and Z would equal whatever C is. Now note, if it ends up that when I'm doing a reduced row echelon and I don't end up with my diagonal of 1s, that would be a situation where there's either a no solution or an infinite number of solutions. So I would treat that a little bit different if that diagonal of 1s doesn't come up. So what we're going to look at first, I'm going to manipulate, and I already see that I have a 1 there, which makes me very happy. That'll be a little bit nicer to work with. So I'm going to take negative 3 times the very first row, and I'm going to add it to row 2 to make a new row 2. So let's do this. And I'm going to kind of color code this. So this is 1, 1, negative 1, and then I have a negative 1. So in red, so what I did is I take negative 3 times 1 right here, plus this row 2, and that's going to give me 0. And then I keep working through, and I say, okay, negative 3 times 1, well, that's negative 3, plus a negative 1, which would give me a negative 4. And negative 1 times a negative 3, which is a positive 3, and I add it to 1, which would give me a 4. And then I take negative 1 times a negative 3, which is a positive 3, and I add it to negative 7, and I get a negative 4. So lots going on there. And so I recommend, as I go through this and I do this problem, that you try it again on your own, just to kind of help solidify some of these ideas. So I'm going to go to red now, to blue. And I'm also going to do another manipulation. So let me have an arrow going down here. And I'm going to do another manipulation. And on this one, I'm going to take negative 1 times R1, row 1. I'm going to add it to row 3 to produce a new row 3. So now that's 1 times a negative 1, which is negative 1. And when I add it to this one, I end up with a 0. And so then I add 1 times a negative 1, which is a negative 1. And I add it to negative 4, which is going to give me a negative 5. And then negative 1 times a negative 1, which is 1. And I add it to 2, and I get a 3. And then same here, negative 1 times 1, which is 1. I add it to the negative 25 to get a negative 26 to get a negative 25. Okay, so the arrow there. All right, well, I see that I have this row, this nice little pretty row of all reds, in red, that it has all these 4. So it would really be nice if I could just divide that through, and I can, as long as I do it to everything in that row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this new row, this row 2 right now, I'm going to divide it by a negative 4 to get me this new row 2. So let's go back here. And I have 1, 1, negative 1, and 1. And I'm going to go in green to show this manipulation. So 0 times a negative 4, that's just 0. But negative 4 times a negative 4, well, that will give me 1. And 4 divided by, not times, divided by a negative 4 is going to give me negative 1. And then I'll get a 1 here. So you can see I'm heading in the direction of my ultimate goal right over here. All right, so well, let's see what we want to do next. Now, I'm gonna get colorful here. While we're at it, how about we take this new row 2 that I have, and I'm gonna take this new row 2, and I'm gonna multiply it by a 5. And I'm going to add it to row 3 to create a new row 3. And I'm looking at from this row, this part right here. Okay, so I am just combining some steps here. So that's going to be 5 times 1 plus a negative 5, which gives me that 0. Now that 5 times 0 plus 0, obviously that's just going to be 0. And then I keep going. So I have 5 times a negative 1, which is a negative 5, plus 3, which is going to give me a negative 2. And then 5 times a negative 4, which is going to give me a negative 5, well, let me choose 5. I'm sorry, I'm looking right here. 5 times 1 right here, which is going to give me 5 plus this negative 25, which is going to give me a negative 20. So just for clarification, I was manipulating this row, adding it to this row to get my new row 3. All right, so now what? Well, I'm looking at this. I'm going to go back to, let's go back to red. I'm looking at this right here, and I see I'm so close. So if I just took that row 3 and divided it by a negative 2, I could get this new row 3. All right, so let's, I'm going to erase this over here. Again, keeping that ultimate goal in mind, my diagonal of 1s. So coming up over here. So now I have, let's get this all up. So I have the 1, 1, negative 1, and 1. So now, and then I have that 0, 1, negative 1, and 1. And so now I'm going to take that row 3 and divide it all by a negative 2. So that's going to stay, the zeros aren't going to be affected, but then that gives me 1, and then when I take negative 20 divided by negative 2, I get 10. And this makes me super, super happy because I can see I have this row of 0, 0, 1, and 10. That tells me right now that my z variable is going to equal 10. So now I'm just going to have to mess it around with it to get the rest of the diagonal of zeros into place. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take row 3, I'm going to add it to row 2 to get a new row 2. And the reason I'm doing that is right here, because I can see that 1 plus a negative 1 is going to give me that 0. So let's go here. So I'm going to leave the bottom alone because that's exactly what I want. I do not want to mess with that any further. So this new row 2 is going to be 0 plus 0, well that's 0, and 0 plus 1, well that's 1, but then 1 plus a negative 1, well that's 0, and then 10 plus 1, that gives me 11. And again, I'm really happy now because now I know y is 11. Well, while I'm at it, let's do one final thing, and let's go ahead, and while we're here, I'm going to take row 3 plus row 1 to give me a new row 1. So the next thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to take 0 plus 1. Well, that's going to give me a 1. I'm going to take 0. Well, I still have a 1 there, so that's going to be a little tricky, but 0 plus 1, no, that's still going to give me a 1. But then if I take 1 plus a negative 1, well, that's 0. And then if I take 10 plus that 1, that is going to give me 11, which is not quite where I want to be yet, but we're getting there. All right, hang on one second. I paused for a moment because something wasn't looking right. And And when I look back, I realize that we missed one major detail. And the thing is I'm going to go in gray here, and I'm going to show you what I found, is that in all of my lecturing and paying attention to my colors, I did not write that negative sign in there. And I missed that negative sign. Now, I haven't manipulated with row 1 very much, so it didn't throw off a whole lot. So I just manipulated with it in the beginning, but I never rewrote it. But I did find that I did miss that negative sign. So how would that change things? Is that right here, when I did row 3 plus row 1, that's, if I did this plus this, I will find that I'll end up with a 9 and not, I'm going to put it in gray so you can see that that correction was made. It's going to end up with a 9. So that's really important to note. So it doesn't change the fact that right now I know that Z is 10 and Y is 11. I just got to find out what that X is. And I just had to pause it and look and say, okay, well, something's not right. And I realized it was because I dropped that negative sign. So it's always so important to pay very close attention to the details. All right, the final thing I'm going to do is my final manipulation. I'm going to look at this and I'm saying, all right, I'm going to take row 2 and I'm going to actually multiply it by a -1. And I'm going to add it to row 1 to get my final row 1. So let's come back here. I have my 0, 0, 1, 10, 0, 1, 0, 11. So then when I do that, I take -1 times this, which is 0, and I add it to this just to actually get that 1. And then I take -1 times 1, which is -1. I add it to this, and that's where that 0 comes into place. And then I take -1 times 0 plus that's still going to stay 0. And then -1 times a -11. I'm sorry, -1 times 11, which is -11. I add it then to the 9 to end up with a -2. So note that I'm just going to erase that little mark right here because I did want to note that it was 11. I just put that little dot there to show that that was what I was working with. And now I have my final answer. I see X is equal to -2, Y is equal to 11, and Z is equal to 10. And that's how I used reduced row echelon to be able to find the solution to this particular this system of linear equations. There is a nice way to do it in the calculator, which will be the next thing I show you, is how to put it in the calculator.